For 34 years, the town of Hollis Mill, Virginia, believed that Eunice Tolliver had simply walked away. She was the postmistress, 58 years old, a fixture behind the counter for 3 decades. And one autumn morning in 1985, she didn't open the post office, and she was never seen again. Her car was in her drive. Her house was tidy. And because a small amount of postal money was found to be missing along with her, the official conclusion settled into place and stayed there. Eunice Tolliver had taken the money and left. It would take 34 years, the renovation of an old building, and a contractor's crew breaking through a false wall in a basement to prove that Eunice Tolliver never left Hollis Mill at all, and to name the man who had let the whole town believe she'd robbed it and run. That is not a story about a trusted woman who stole and vanished. That is a story about a good woman whose own murder was disguised as her disgrace, and about the 34 years that lie sat on her name until a sledgehammer found the truth behind a wall. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the Virginia foothills in the autumn of 1985, and to the woman the town was so willing to think the worst of. Hollis Mill in 1985 sat in the rolling foothills of the Virginia Blue Ridge, apple orchards on the slopes, a single main street, a feed store, 2 churches, and a small brick post office that was, in a town with no stoplight, something close to a town hall. The post office was where you heard the news, mailed the package, signed for the letter, and got asked after your mother. And for 30 years, it had been run by Eunice Tolliver, which made her, in a quiet way, one of the most known and trusted people in the county. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone, every single day, knew Eunice. Eunice Tolliver was 58, a widow, the postmistress of Hollis Mill for 3 decades. She was precise, kind, and incorruptible in the small daily ways a town notices. She'd hold a struggling family's bill payment a day so it wouldn't bounce. She knew every child's name. She'd never been so much as a penny off in her postal accounts in 30 years, a fact the town would later have to reckon with. She sang alto in the Methodist choir and tended the most admired dahlia bed in the county. She had no children, but a great many people she looked after, and a nephew, her late sister's boy, who was the closest thing she had to a son. And Eunice had one habit the town knew her by. Every morning before she opened the window, she wound and set the old brass-cased post office clock on the wall, government property older than she was, and she was so reliably punctual that people set their watches by the moment the post office light came on. If Eunice's light was on, it was 8 o'clock. The whole town ran on it. On the morning of October 3rd, 1985, the post office light did not come on, and the town's clock, in a sense, stopped, because Eunice Tolliver was gone and would not be seen again. Here is the story the town let itself believe. When Eunice didn't open up and didn't answer her door, and her car sat untouched in her drive, the sheriff was called. A search of the post office turned up the thing that decided everything. The cash drawer and the day's postal funds were short by a few $100s, and a small amount of cash was missing from her home as well. To the sheriff, a man named Carl Hutchins, the picture assembled itself with depressing ease. An aging widow, alone, had skimmed what she could and slipped away, the way people sometimes do. A federal postal inspector came, looked at the missing funds, and the two of them landed on the same conclusion. Eunice Tolliver had embezzled and absconded. There was no real search for a body, because the theory said she was alive and gone. There was a warrant, in fact, for a woman the town would slowly decide had fooled them all for 30 years. And Hollis Mill, hurt and betrayed, let the postmistress it had trusted become the postmistress who'd robbed it and run. The detail that screamed against the story, to the one person who'd listened to it, was the 30 years of perfect accounts. Eunice Tolliver had not been a penny off in 3 decades. A woman planning to embezzle and vanish does not begin and end her criminal career with a few $100s. The sum was insultingly small for a life thrown away, exactly the amount a killer might take to manufacture a motive. And there were the dahlias she'd never see bloom, the choir solo she'd rehearsed for the next Sunday, the car she left behind, the nephew she'd never have left without a word. But the missing money was concrete, and the perfect accounts were just a character reference, and concrete won. The person who never believed it was the nephew, a young man named Gerald, her late sister's son, who knew his aunt as the most honest person he'd ever known and could not square the woman who'd raised him on Sundays with the thief the county described. He fought the embezzlement finding for years, wrote to the postal service, to the sheriff, to anyone, insisting his aunt had not stolen and run, that something had been done to her. He was one grieving nephew against a federal finding and a warrant, and his certainty changed nothing. The warrant stood. His aunt's name stayed dirty. Gerald grew old carrying it. The institutional failure here was the way a small financial discrepancy was allowed to write off a human being. The missing money gave everyone, the sheriff, the postal inspector, the town, a tidy story that required no body, no search, no homicide investigation, just a warrant and a sense of betrayal. It was easier to believe a trusted woman was secretly a thief than to believe a killer had murdered her and taken a few $100s to make it look like flight. Eunice Tolliver wasn't failed by a botched search. She was failed by a lie that was cheaper to believe than the truth, and the lie cost only her good name and the town's small effort, a bargain everyone unconsciously took. Then the case went cold behind a warrant, which is the coldest place of all, because the official story said there was no victim to find, only a fugitive who'd never be caught because she'd been clever. The town moved on, nursing its sense of betrayal. The post office got a new postmistress. The brass clock on the wall got wound by other hands, and Eunice Tolliver passed into local legend as the postmistress who robbed Hollis Mill and disappeared. By 1995, 10 years had passed. Eunice's house had been sold, her famous dahlia bed dug under by owners who'd never heard of her, or had heard only the bad version. The postmistress who robbed the town and ran. Sheriff Hutchins had retired, the case a tidy closed embezzlement on his record, a fugitive who'd simply never been caught. Gerald, the nephew, still wrote his letters, to the postal service, to the new sheriff, to anyone who might listen, and still got his polite final dismissals, and still tended, alone, the grave of his mother, Eunice's sister, where he stubbornly kept the adjoining plot empty and waiting for an aunt the law insisted was a living fugitive somewhere out in the world. By 2015, the old downtown of Hollis Mill was being slowly revived. The empty brick storefronts bought up one by one and renovated into shops and apartments by people betting on the town's charm. The original post office building, replaced by a newer one decades before and long since sold into private hands, had passed through several owners and sat empty now, a handsome old brick structure with good bones, until a developer bought it to convert. Gerald was elderly by then, his letters long unanswered, his aunt 30 years a fugitive on paper and in the town's memory. He had all but given up the hope that anyone would ever clear her name, that the truth would ever be anything but the lie the town had settled on. The answer, it seemed, had walked out of Hollis Mill with Eunice and was never coming back. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Eunice. The case had been closed as an embezzlement for 34 years when a renovation crew swung a sledgehammer in the wrong wall, or the right one. In 2019, the developer converting the old post office building had a crew working in the basement, an oddly small basement, it turned out, for the building's footprint. A worker measuring for a new staircase realized the basement was shorter on one side than the building above it, and that a section of the old brick wall down there was newer than the rest. Laid by the mortar sometime in the 1980s, in a building that hadn't been touched in decades. They broke through it. Behind the false wall was a sealed cavity, and in the cavity were the skeletal remains of a woman, and with them a tarnished brass name bar of the kind worn on a postal uniform, reading Tolliver. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and it required no technology more advanced than a sledgehammer and a tape measure, only a renovation that finally disturbed a building everyone had stopped thinking about. Eunice Tolliver had never left Hollis Mill. She had been sealed behind a basement wall in her own post office for 34 years, a few dozen feet from the counter where she'd served the town for 3 decades, while that same town believed she'd robbed it and fled. Gerald was an old man when the sheriff's office called to tell him that his aunt had been found, not as a fugitive in some distant city, but behind a wall in the building where she'd worked her whole life, exactly where a 34-year-old lie had insisted she was not. He had been right since 1985. He asked, the family said, only one question. Did this mean her name would be cleared? It did. A body sealed in a wall is not a woman who embezzled and fled. It is a murder, and a murder staged as a theft. The few $100s taken from the drawer and her home had never been a motive. It had been a costume, dressing a killing as a flight. So the question became who, in October of 1985, had access to that post office and that basement, and reason to want Eunice Tolliver dead. Investigators went into the records and found the thread. In the months before she vanished, Eunice, incorruptible, precise, 30 years without an error, had discovered something wrong. A scheme running through the mail, a fraud, with someone using the Hollis Mill post office to move stolen checks and money orders. And the man positioned to run such a scheme, the man with after-hours access to the building and the basement, was the postal route contractor and part-time custodian who serviced the office. Vernon Pruitt. Then in his 30s, a trusted local who held the keys. Eunice had figured it out. Investigators found, in surviving postal correspondence, that she had flagged irregularities to a regional office in the weeks before she disappeared and signaled she intended to report more. Vernon Pruitt's fraud and his freedom depended on her silence. Her murder solved his problem and, dressed as embezzlement, even pinned his own crime's missing money on her. The stolen funds in his scheme reframed as the funds she'd supposedly skimmed when she fled. It was, in its way, a perfect lie. It killed her, hid her, and slandered her, all at once. Vernon Pruitt was in his late 60s now, long retired, a respected old-timer in a county 2 over. His decades-old scheme and the woman he'd walled up never once suspected. He had not been hidden behind wealth or power. He had been hidden behind a lie so tidy that an entire town had preferred it to the truth, behind everyone's willingness to believe the postmistress was a thief. Investigators built the case with what the wall gave up and the records preserved. Forensic examination established that Eunice had been killed, not merely concealed. The mortar dated the false wall to the period of her disappearance. The postal records documented the fraud she'd uncovered and Pruitt's access, and confronted at last. An old man certain his wall would stand forever. Vernon Pruitt gave way. He admitted that Eunice had caught his scheme and meant to bring it down, that he had killed her in the post office after hours, and that he had spent a long night bricking her into the basement of the building she loved, and taken a few $100s from her drawer and her home to make the town believe she'd run. For 34 years, the town had believed exactly that. When the truth came out, Hollis Mill was forced to confront a shame deeper than grief. The shame of having thought the worst, for 34 years, of a woman who had been murdered for being honest. The arrest of Vernon Pruitt shocked the community. But the harder reckoning was with the eagerness of the original lie. How readily the town had traded its trust in Eunice for a tidy story. How willing everyone had been to believe a 30-year servant was a secret thief, rather than imagine she'd been killed and hidden in plain sight beneath the floor they'd walked across to mail their letters. Vernon Pruitt pleaded guilty in 2020 and was sentenced. He was an old man, and no sentence could return the 34 years Eunice spent slandered behind a wall. But her name was cleared, formally and completely. The decades-old embezzlement warrant withdrawn, the federal record corrected, an apology issued for a finding that had branded a murdered woman a thief. The town that had believed the lie held a service for her at the Methodist church, where she'd sung alto and planted, beside the restored old post office, a bed of dahlias, and Gerald, the nephew who'd written letters for 34 years into silence, finally buried his aunt beside his mother, in the plot he'd stubbornly kept, under a stone that gave her back her title. Eunice Tolliver, postmistress of Hollis Mill, honest to the last. Eunice Tolliver was 58 years old. She ran the heart of a small town for 30 years and was never a penny off, held struggling families' bills so they wouldn't bounce, sang alto, grew the county's finest dahlias, and wound the post office clock every morning so the whole town could set its watch by her. She did not embezzle and flee. She was murdered for catching a thief and walled into the basement of the building she'd given her life to, and slandered for 34 years to hide it, until a renovation finally found her. The nephew who never once believed the lie was proven right and lived to clear her name. And a woman the town had thought the worst of was restored, at last, to the truth of who she'd been. It makes you wonder. How many disappearances were closed as something shameful? A theft, a desertion, a running off, because a small, staged detail made the worst story the easy one? How many bodies are sealed in walls and floors and foundations right now, found only when a building is finally torn open? And what does it do to a person's memory to be slandered in their own absence, with no way to defend themselves, for decades? Tell us in the comments. Do you think Eunice's name would ever have been cleared if that old building hadn't been renovated? What detail stayed with you most? The perfect 30-year accounts, the clock she wound each morning, the wall in the basement of her own post office, and how many they stole and ran cases from decades past do you believe were never that at all? Justice came for Eunice Tolliver after 34 years. Given up by a wall, a renovation finally broke open. Stories like hers remind us that the tidy, shameful story is not always the true one, that a lie can sit on an innocent name for a generation, and that clearing that name, Restoring a good woman to who she truly was is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.